Hey there guys, this is Richard, your host, with another marvelous video. This time, every 82 deleted scenes from the Alien franchise that would have blown everyone's minds. What started in 1979 with Ridley Scott's Alien went on to become a benchmark and turning point in the field of horror and sci-fi movies. H.R. Giger worked wonders in creating the hideous biomechanical monstrosities that serve as nature's apex killing machine, a predator like no other. Creatures that kill to live and live to kill. Over the decades, characters like Ripley, Bishop, and David have become a phenomenon in their own right. But then again, no good movie has a smooth production, right? From the initial conception and first draft to the final theatrical release, there exists tons of changes and deleted scenes. In this video, we'll explore all the major deleted scenes in the Alien franchise, beginning with Ridley Scott's Prometheus and Covenant, followed by the 4 Alien movies from 1979 to 1997. On a side note, we've intentionally skipped the Alien vs. Predator universe. Also, there are 82 entries on this list. I've mentioned more than 120 deleted scenes in total. Let's get this vessel in space, shall we? Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. A heated argument. In the film, Kane gets attacked by a facehugger after he touches an ovomorph. The crew tries to remove the creature but fears that the acidic blood will not only kill Kane but also damage the ship's hull. And although the facehugger calmly detaches itself a while later, it had done its job. Kane regains consciousness although with a bit of memory loss. Unfortunately, he dies not long after when a xenomorph chestburster savagely rips out of Kane's chest. After this, there is a fairly long dialogue sequence that was filmed but left out of the movie. The crew of the ship gathers in the mess room to discuss the plan of action with an alien on board. Brett demands suggestions from Ash on ways to kill the young xenomorph, but naturally, Ash has no answers. But then again, they cannot kill it. Lambert points out that the creature's acidic blood would severely damage the ship itself. The crew is visibly tensed and panicking, which leads to a heated argument. And to be honest, such a reaction is fairly justified because the threat is real, and the humans have no idea what they're up against, or how to reach home safely with a vicious alien on board. Ultimately, it's decided that they'll use nets and cattle prods to try and capture the alien so that they can throw it out of the ship into empty space. Although this scene was axed from the theatrical release, one can find it in the novelization of the film. Little flying robotic mice. Ridley Scott's Alien was supposed to begin with a scene having numerous mice-shaped robots flying across the ship to fix problems. These were basically robotic handymen that would find problems, stop by computer banks, and fix things automatically. The robotic mice would move about the corridors, and the audience would have tasted the science fiction element of the film from the very beginning. However, it was this very reason that the sequence was axed. The scene resembled Star Wars in both its look and feel, and Ridley Scott wanted to keep the film as close to reality as possible. Also, Fox Studio didn't want people to draw comparisons between his film and other sci-fi gems that had been released previously. Crew was supposed to sleep nude. In the original script, the crew of Nostromo was supposed to be nude during the long hypersleep. However, more often than not, nudity reduces the audience base, and Fox didn't want to go down this road. In the end, it was decided that the crew would be wearing undergarments while waking up. Despite this, the film's novelization still maintained that the crew was nude in their sleep. When looked at from a macro view, it was essentially a trivial little thing, but it could have had far greater implications for the future of the franchise. I mean, it was quite possible that nudity would have become a staple for all future Alien and Alien vs. Predator movies. The Early Riser. The first version of the script had Kane waking up on Nostromo before all the other crew members. In this scene, you could see him preparing breakfast as other people woke up one by one. Actor John Hurt filmed the scene, but it was considered rather inconsequential for the narrative and deemed unsuitable for the condensed version of the film. However, you can find the scene in the DVD or Blu-ray version of the film as a bonus feature. Alien and Prometheus share more than we thought. In Alien, they initially planned to give Ms. Lambert a computerized holographic map that would be projected on the inside of her helmet. This would have helped her, Kane, and Dallas explore the moon in a more efficient manner. The difficult terrain and poor visibility demanded something of this sort, but the trio had to go out without said helmet, probably because of budgetary constraints. Nevertheless, the idea was adopted by Ridley Scott in his film Prometheus, in which the crew had their vitals and other important information projected on their visors. The Rock and the Derelict. So, the reason why the crew was present on the moon was that the ship's computer called Mother had picked up a transmission coming from the moon. Mother awakened the crew, and they were tasked with exploring the place. It was Lambert, Kane, and Dallas who were asked to physically reach the source of said transmission. While moving to their destination, the three of them rested near a huge rock formation. And although they later moved on, Ash was watching the rock formation from the Nostromo science station. He discovered that the rock was, in fact, the carcass of a space jockey which had become fossilized. This sequence was to effectively bring space jockeys or engineers into the fold of the alien universe because the studio was initially unwilling to allow Ridley Scott to build the derelict owing to monetary reasons. Strangely enough, they later did allow the set to be built, and we could see the three humans entering it. However, the scene was cut from the final movie because it turned out to be a lot more than the script and the movie demanded. The mural of xenomorph reproduction. So, H.R. Giger completed a mural that depicted the reproductive cycle of xenomorphs. It showed how a facehugger emerges from an egg and subdues its host before the chestburster rips apart the host to come out. The mural was to be shown inside the derelict, and the crew was supposed to find it. In fact, even test footage was filmed with the mural in which one could see a torch beam moving over it. However, Ridley Scott couldn't find an appropriate place to keep the scene in the movie, so it was axed. Another reason why it didn't make it into the final cut was that it gave away too much information about how xenomorphs reproduced and would have dampened the impact of the horrifying chestburster sequence. The egg silo. Among all the differences between the film and the original script, one was the location of the egg silo. In the film, we see the eggs in the derelict, but that wasn't the initial plan. The plan was to have a secondary location on LV-426 where the crew would find the eggs. It was supposed to be a pyramid-like structure that the crew would have found after investigating the derelict. According to the script, the crew would make use of the lull in the storm to somehow reach this structure on the horizon. However, upon finding that the place didn't have any discernible entrance, Kane would scale to the top of the structure to find an opening that was protected by a thin membrane, much like the amniotic sac. As expected, Kane would then go inside and lower himself to the bottom, where he'd find a cavernous space leading to an altar with the ovomorphs placed on it. To illuminate the place for cinematic purposes, his suit was to be fitted with lights. However, the sequence was dropped because having two locations for xenomorphs on LV-426 would have been expensive. More about Kane. Several sequences featuring Kane were shot, but never made it into the final cut. These included scenes like the one where he got facehugged, but it was shot from his perspective. He was studying the ovomorph when the event took place. You can find the scene in the Alien Special Collector's Edition and Alien Anthology box set. Furthermore, there was one small sequence where Ash could be seen helping a face-hugged Kane back on the ship. Another interesting deleted scene about Kane was the one with the autodoc, which was basically a remotely operated device used for medical purposes. Furthermore, the acid from the facehugger burnt through the decks of the Nostromo. Lambert came to the infirmary and asked if Kane had been exposed to the acid. Soon, the rest also reached the infirmary, and after looking at the X-ray, Ripley found that Kane's lungs had some sort of stain. Things seemed quite tense, and they all just wanted to leave the moon, and so Dallas asked Brett and Parker to fix the ship as soon as possible. One can find this sequence in the DVD version. Kane's funeral. In the film, Kane was violently thrown out of the Nostromo and into the depths of space. However, that wasn't really what was initially planned. Instead of this inconsiderate funeral, Kane's body was to be taken by a couple of crew members in spacesuits, and they were to set adrift his body gently and respectfully. After the funeral, Dallas confronted Ash and raised some serious allegations against Ash. Dallas said that Ash knew about the chestburster embryo. He then went on to say that Ash actively tried to protect the embryo. Although Ash denied the allegations, Dallas's suspicions were not alleviated. The so-called stress relief. Originally, the crew members were to make love to each other on a rather regular and free-use basis because long-haul intra-galaxy trips tend to build a whole lot of tension in the crew. In one such scene, Ripley found Dallas and told him that she needed some stress relief. However, such scenes were removed from the final cut. Interestingly enough, this was the scene that Sigourney Weaver was asked to enact for her screen test. In another deleted scene, Ripley soothed Lambert after one of the crew members died, and it's then that she asked Lambert if she had slept with Ash. Although Lambert said that she hadn't, it was quite obvious that they had slept together. It would have happened during the course of their journey. Brett's altered death. In the movie, Brett follows Jones the cat into one of the landing leg compartments, but finds a fully grown xenomorph in there. The monster attacks Brett and disappears along with the body. As opposed to this, Brett was actually supposed to die when the adult xenomorph stuck its inner jaw into Brett's chest to pull out his heart. It would have been similar to the carcass of the engineer that they found on the derelict. However, Ridley Scott felt that this scene was way too similar to the death sequence of Kane. So, Scott filmed another sequence in which the xenomorph would lift poor Brett and simply crush his skull. But once again, this sequence wasn't included in the film.
Ash? Any suggestions from you or Mother?
The computer key subplot. After much ado, the crew figures that the xenomorph must be hiding in the vents. So Dallas decides that it should be him to check out the vents and flush out the xenomorph because he's the senior-most member of the crew. But anything can happen in the vents, and he may very well not return. As the captain of the ship, Dallas has many responsibilities, which include talking to Mother, the ship's computer. However, this requires a master access key, which remains in possession of the senior-most crew member. When Dallas enters the vent, he passes it on to Ash and asks him to give it to Ripley in the event that he fails to return. Dallas does not return, and when Ripley asks Ash about the key, Ash tells her that Dallas never gave it to him. Following this, there's another scene continuing the subplot that was deleted from the final film. Ripley goes to Ash's science blister in search of the computer access key and successfully finds it. Unfortunately, this entire subplot was struck off. Airlock scene. Out of all these deleted scenes, the one that saddens me the most is this one. So, on his way to refuel the flamethrower of Dallas, Parker encounters the xenomorph near the main airlock of the ship. The xenomorph doesn't see Parker, who immediately calls in Lambert and Ripley, requesting them to open the inner airlock door. When the airlock door opens, the xenomorph sees the spinning green light and walks toward it. Lured successfully, Parker then tells the women to open the main airlock. But before that's done, the inner airlock needs to be shut. Just as Ripley does this, an alarm goes off and startles the xenomorph. While escaping, the xenomorph's arm gets stuck and is ripped off, and the acidic blood spilt from the arm burns the inner airlock. In the end, Ripley accuses Ash of aiding the xenomorph in surviving. She goes on to prove this by accessing the Mother. Furthermore, she learns about Special Order 937, according to which Ash's first priority was to bring the organism back home for research, and he was to consider everything else secondary. So much so that even the crew of the ship was considered expendable.
Get out of the way, Lambert!
Lambert's encounter with the xenomorph. Lambert was one of the few members who survived almost the entire movie, but her death was rewritten several times during the course of filming. The footage was filmed in which the xenomorph approaches Ms. Lambert before attacking her. The xenomorph starts curled up on the floor, but gets alarmed when a coolant tank strikes it. Following this, the minion of death unfurls its tail and points it at poor Lambert to let the human learn of its presence. It then moves towards Lambert like a crab. Upon approaching Lambert, the xenomorph sort of studies and explores her. If Lambert wasn't terrified enough already, the xenomorph stands tall above her, revealing its full height. However, this sequence turned out to reveal a bit too much of the xenomorph, including the fact that the beast was nothing more than a man in a suit. Naturally, it was effectively cut out from the final movie.
Get out of the way, Lambert!
Lambert's death. Lambert's death was one of the sequences that was rewritten the most times. To put a number on it, there were at least 6 different ways the production team wanted her to die. The first draft had named her Melkonis, and in that draft, she was to die when the xenomorph twisted her head. In the next draft, she was to be captured by the xenomorph and taken away, but that was the fate that Dallas eventually had to suffer. In fact, one of the drafts had Dallas telling Ripley that the xenomorph had, in fact, eaten Lambert. Later, a revised script had Parker accidentally burning Lambert with a flamethrower, but that would have been superfluous. But that's not all. They'd also planned to send her into space through a small hole in the Nostromo's hull, but monetary restrictions and special effects constraints saved her from that fate. In the end, Lambert was killed off-screen. A little something about Ripley. Much like the nude cryosleep idea was dropped from the final cut, they had originally envisioned making Ripley strip down completely naked. She was to do this while attempting to get into her spacesuit, but Fox must have deemed the sequence inappropriate for the film, and Ripley was allowed to keep her undergarments. Another interesting and game-changing deleted scene was the death of Ripley. Scott originally wanted her to die along with the xenomorph. It would have bitten off her head. However, the ending would have been exceptionally dark and would have affected the film's box office collection. In the end, she was allowed to kill the xenomorph and emerge victorious. Those were all the major deleted scenes in the original Alien movie. Let's quickly jump to the ones in James Cameron's Aliens. shortened early scenes. So, to escape the destruction of the Nostromo, Ripley took Jones the cat and got into Narcissus, the lifeboat. It was found decades later by a salvage ship. Ripley and Jones were transferred to the Gateway Station for recovery. However, the sequence in which Narcissus was found was actually quite longer than what was shown in the film. It was to start with the salvage ship finding and scanning the Narcissus with a searchlight before actually approaching it. Had it been in the movie, it would have only helped increase the importance and significance of Narcissus being found after so many years. Ripley's nightmares. In the movie, Ripley found herself plagued with nightmares of a chestburster trying to come out by savagely ripping through her. However, in the initial draft, she was to dream of other nightmares aboard the Gateway Station. In these horrific dreams, she would see that she was back on the Nostromo, the vessel of doom. She would run through the corridors of Nostromo, trying desperately to find a way out, but to no avail. In the end, she does find a hatch, but upon opening it, she finds a xenomorph which will stand tall before her. It was at this point that her nightmare would end, and she'd wake up with horrifying screams aboard the Gateway Station.
I promised her that I would be home for her birthday.
Some promises you just can't keep. Out of the many deleted scenes was also a scene with Ripley's daughter Amanda. In the initial draft of the script, Carter Burke, the Weyland-Yutani Corporation representative and a bad guy, expanded more on Amanda's death while speaking to Ripley. He told her that her daughter died of cancer and that she was cremated at a Wisconsin mortuary. Although absent from the movie, the dialogues made their way into the novelization of Aliens. Additionally, he tried to console her because Ripley had promised Amanda that she would be home for the little girl's 11th birthday. Burke told her, "Some promises you just can't keep." However, this was a pretty fake and inconsiderate consolation because Burke kept looking at his watch as he was quite anxious about attending the due hearing of Ripley. Day-to-day life in Hadley's Hope. Well, given that Hadley's Hope was such an important place for the film's narrative, we actually got to see very little of the colony there or how life worked in such severe conditions. However, several minutes of footage of the day-to-day life in Hadley's Hope was filmed in the initial parts of the production. There exists footage that shows Hadley's Hope had a bar and a grill. Furthermore, in one of them, it could be seen that colonists often struggled with covering the vehicles and machinery when gale-force winds hit the colony. Some of it could be seen in the extended cut, but they were chopped off from the first release of the final film. The first contact. So, in the first draft of the script, Russ Jordan, Newt's father, gets subdued by a facehugger. Newt's mother, Anne, calls for help, and it isn't before long that a rescue team arrives at the location after responding to Anne's SOS call. The rescue team then goes on to investigate the derelict ship and finds more overmorphs, of which come facehuggers that subdue these unfortunate men. But before that happens, the humans also find the remains of an engineer, whose body is partially covered in volcanic debris. It would have been a rather interesting scene to watch, but budgetary restrictions led to its deletion even before the filming had begun. However, in 1992, Dark Horse published a 2-issue comic titled Newt's Tale, which detailed these events.
Hey, Bishop, man. Do the thing with the knife.
Please.
Come on, yeah.
Bishop and Terminator. In the film, Bishop made his entry by playing the more complex version of the knife game. However, that was not what they'd previously envisioned. He was to be introduced alone and wandering on USS Sulaco. The synthetic would have taken care of the ship and its denizens while the crew remained in cryosleep. However, this version of his introduction was axed, but it can be found in the film's novelization. Interestingly enough, the concept was later adopted by Ridley Scott in his films Prometheus and Covenant, where David and Walter are shown wandering about the ship. I titled this entry Bishop and Terminator, right? Well, in the initial phases, it was decided that Bishop's manufacturer would be Cyberdyne Systems, the same company that designed and manufactured the Terminator in James Cameron's previous film. But the inside joke was dropped, and Bishop was shown to have been manufactured by Hyperdyne Systems.
All right, sweethearts, what are you waiting for? Breakfast in bed? Another glorious day in the Corps.
USS Sulaco. As the Colonial Marines woke up from their hypersleep aboard USS Sulaco, one of the Marines was supposed to say, "I'm too old for this shit." Although this dialogue was removed from the final cut, Danny Glover's character of Detective Roger Murtaugh used the same catchphrase in his Lethal Weapon films. Now, as you may know, Danny Glover was the main protagonist of the second Predator film. That's quite a coincidence, don't you think? Furthermore, the men and women aboard USS Sulaco were supposed to shower naked in Aliens, but that never happened because the actresses refused to strip on camera. M577 armored personnel carrier. In the script for Aliens, Bishop, Burke and Gorman entered the colony, but Ripley stayed behind in the APC. The woman was way too horrified from her last adventure aboard the Nostromo and couldn't bring herself to leave the safety of the vehicle. However, she later concluded that it was better to be with others inside the colony than alone and outside. She rushed out of the door to reach the others, but found that the access lock of the colony was shut. Ripley found herself in a worse position, and now she was neither inside the APC nor with her colleagues. All by herself, trapped outside and unable to reach those inside, she began to panic. But Wazbowski came to her rescue. However, he scared the crap out of her before opening the door to the colony. Deleted APC scenes. In the movie, Gorman was rendered incapacitated due to falling crates. However, in the script, he was to become paralyzed after getting stung by a xenomorph. In fact, the script goes into great detail regarding this. So, as the armored personnel carrier would try to escape the vicinity of the atmosphere processing unit, a xenomorph would jump on the APC and rip out the hatch without any difficulty. As it happened, Gorman would be hiding under the hatch and get partially pulled when the xenomorph pulled the hatch. The xenomorph would use its barbed-tipped tail to sting Gorman's shoulder. However, Hicks would shoot down the xenomorph with the APC's turret gun as the other Marines pulled Gorman back down. Personally, I would have loved the turret gun raining fire on a xenomorph. Furthermore, the footage was filmed showing the dropship crashing against the APC, and once again, the said scene only exists in the novelization. Alien behavior and intelligence. A couple of deleted scenes also detailed the intelligence of the xenomorph queen and the general nature and behavior of xenomorph drones. So, in the script, Bishop concluded that the xenomorph queen's decision to choose the atmosphere processor as the location for her hive was, in fact, an intelligent and thoughtful one. She must have known that in order to destroy the hive, the atmosphere processor must be destroyed, and that would in turn destroy the entire colony, killing everyone present there. So, the atmosphere processor offered protection against incoming fire. Also, Bishop encountered a xenomorph drone in the conduit. When the xenomorph lunged at the synthetic, he didn't react to the advances. The xenomorph immediately lost its interest, which basically meant that xenomorphs only attacked perceived threats, or at least they preferred to engage with targets that threatened them. This was also elaborated in the experiments conducted by one Dr. Church on a bunch of xenomorphs. You can check out our video, in which we dive deep into the demented character of Dr. Church. Burke's altered ending. This entry has to be the most famous deleted scene in James Cameron's films. So, in the movie, Burke died after xenomorphs attacked the Colonial Marines, and a gunfight ensued. However, that wasn't the send-off that the creators had initially planned to give Burke. In the script, Ripley was looking for Newt inside the Queen's hive. Suddenly, a hand reached out of nowhere and grabbed Ripley. As it happened, Burke had been cocooned to one of the walls by xenomorphs, and a chestburster was residing inside him, about to break open. In fact, Burke went on to say that he could feel the creature moving inside him and begged Ripley to save his sorry soul. However, he was a lost cause by then, and she handed him a grenade so that he could end things for himself and save himself from a horrific fate. As Ripley turned to leave, he apologized for the things he did, but James Cameron chose to do away with this important scene. Introduction of xenomorph drones. The script for Aliens featured something called the xenomorph drones. These were supposed to be white in color and smaller than the regular drones, whom the film labeled as warriors. According to the script, when Ripley entered the hive to confront the Queen, the said drones went about their regular hive business and didn't react to the presence of a human. However, this description sounded similar to the xenomorph cast of the Workers. Interestingly, Workers were among the very rare xenomorphs that were non-violent. Workers didn't engage when the hive was in threat and escaped the scene when attacked. And with that, we come to the end of the differences between the theatrical release of the Aliens movie and the other versions of the script. Time to move on to Alien 3. But before we do that, we must tell you that Alien 3's production was the most troublesome among all the Alien movies. I mean, there were close to 11 draft scripts that were written for the movie. Altered early scenes. In Alien 3, we saw that it was the emergence of a facehugger from an overmorph that led to a fire, which forced the Sulaco's computer mainframe to launch an emergency escape vehicle that ultimately crash-landed on Fiorina 161, or Fury. However, in the earlier drafts, it was envisioned that the fire would start after a chestburster would erupt from Hicks in his cryosleep. It would have destroyed the cryotube, leading to a fire. It would have been this fire that would have destroyed the Sulaco and damaged the guidance system of the emergency escape vehicle. This would make it crash land on Fiorina 161, a maximum security correctional prison and foundry. However, most parts of this sequence were dropped from the final film. Additionally, the EEV's crash was to be more elaborate. For instance, after crashing into the ocean of Fiorina 161, it would have sunk so deep that the water pressure would have crushed the vehicle, and it would have come up to the surface after the deployment of the airbags. Newt was supposed to be more important. Alien 3 left everyone surprised by revealing that it was Ripley who had been impregnated with a royal chestburster embryo. We don't know if it was Alien 3's only strength or its greatest weakness, but the earliest draft wanted Newt to be the impregnated one. When the escape pod drowned following the crash, the embryonic xenomorph pushed itself out of her throat and entered Ripley's body through her mouth. It would have done so because Ripley, being an adult, had a better chance of survival than Newt, a young girl. In fact, one of the draft scripts also had Ripley dreaming about a similar scenario. There, Newt spat xenomorph slime on Ripley before a young xenomorph queen came out of Newt's mouth, and Ripley found herself horrified and in shock. Unfortunately enough, both these scenes were axed, but if you come to think of it, Newt would have died anyway because a xenomorph embryo essentially nourishes itself using the host's body. Speaking of dreams, another dream sequence left out from the movie was the one in which Ripley found herself back in Sulaco's hypersleep bay, where she searched for a xenomorph. Although armed with a flamethrower, the xenomorph pinned her down and sexually assaulted her. The aquatic facehugger. Unfortunately enough, the film's creators decided not to feature the aquatic facehugger, despite H.R. Giger creating a design for the same. Yes, we did get the runner xenomorph, but no one would have complained if the aquatic facehugger swam ashore from the EEV. A changed job profile. In the film, they said that the prisoners on Fiorina 161 were supposed to take care of the lead foundry and man the blast furnace. However, in an alternate version of the same scene, Clemens explained to Ripley that the prisoners were tasked with monitoring the large volumes of toxic waste that was dumped on the prison planet. Furthermore, they would also manufacture shields of lead that will later be used to prevent the toxic waste from leaking. Although a seemingly minor difference, it was made because of cinematic reasons.
Would you like to tell me what we're really looking for?
Newt's autopsy. Ripley was afraid that Newt's corpse may be carrying a xenomorph embryo, so she took help from Clemens, the prison doctor, to perform an autopsy on Newt. However, the said autopsy wasn't as graphic and gory as it was in the script, according to which Newt's dissected body was to be shot in close-up. All the surgical procedures and internal organs were to be shown in great detail, but this sequence was received poorly by the test audiences. About the uncut autopsy scene, makeup artist Greg Canham said that people simply walked out after watching the scene.
Amen.
Fear of gore. Much like the toned-down version of Newt's autopsy, 2 more sequences were removed or cut short because they didn't want the film to become too gory. So, Murphy's death was supposed to be much more violent. After getting attacked by the runner's xenomorph's acidic spit, and the prosthetic appliances would have been shot in close-up. Furthermore, his remains would have splattered all across the ventilation shaft, but these scenes never made it into the final film. Additionally, the sequence in which the chestburster erupted out of the dog was to be more violent, with the little xenomorph coming out covered in a horrific mix of gore and blood. Clemens and his past. First things first, there was a sex scene between Ripley and Clemens that was shot but axed later, and I guess we all know why. Anyway, Clemens tells Ripley that he was on Fiorina 161 because he'd accidentally killed a bunch of injured workers with an overdose of painkillers. However, Rex Pickett's version of the script made him commit a more tragic crime. He told Ripley that he'd euthanized a pregnant woman in a coma, and this woman happened to be his wife. Of course, he did all he could, but there was no chance of recovery. Interestingly, even Clemens' death was supposed to be much more violent and graphic than what we saw in the movie. The footage was shot with blood squirting from Clemens' head as he died. Golic, the monster. In one of the draft scripts, Ripley's scan was more detailed and extended. According to it, along with the royal chestburster, there were thousands of microscopic ovomorphs growing inside her, and these microscopic ovomorphs would have grown larger inside the xenomorph queen before being laid by her. This scan was witnessed by Golic, a mass murderer who was so deranged that he was an outcast among violent prisoners. He freed the xenomorph in the movie and died in the process, but in one of the draft scripts, he was supposed to survive and spy on Ripley. In the same script, Golic was to go on a rampage by killing several inmates by slitting their throats and stabbing them in the heart. Meat Locker. One of the most crucial scenes that was cut from Alien 3 was the one featuring a xenomorph hive. The runner xenomorph had built a hive in the assembly hall of the prison in which it cocooned several of the inmates alive. They were supposed to serve as hosts for the ovomorphs that the Queen would have laid after she'd matured. Dillon and Morse would have found the hive and would have burned the place to the ground, only to realize much later that the xenomorph was also present there. Dillon, being the good man that he was, would push Morse away and lock the door of the assembly hall so that he could face the xenomorph alone. He would even say a little prayer of sorts, basically saying that despite being plunged into darkness and evil, he had not left the sight of God. The fire alarm would alert Aaron and Ripley, who would come to the spot and helplessly watch Dillon as he was killed by the xenomorph. The beast would then drag Dillon's body away. Clearly, Dillon died much earlier in this script than in the film. Furthermore, they also find Golic's cocooned body, and much like Burke from Aliens, Golic was also repenting the things he had done.
Ripley.
Golic and Aaron's role reversal. In one of the draft scripts, Golic was to survive until the end, and he was supposed to be the man to meet and greet the men from Weyland-Yutani and Michael Bishop, the apparent creator of Bishop from Hyperdyne. However, Golic was killed earlier in the film and his spot was taken by Aaron, but even Aaron's extra dialogues were removed from the final film. In the script, he said that Ripley had a xenomorph growing inside her. When the Weyland-Yutani men kept a cage on the ground, he exclaimed that they would have needed a bigger cage. Altered death sequences. So, I already mentioned in an earlier entry that one of the draft scripts planned to kill Dillon quite early in the story. In fact, his death sequence was rewritten several times. In the meat locker scene, the xenomorph punctured his chest and dragged him away. His death was later moved to the final battle in the leadworks. Ripley and Dillon had wrongly presumed that the xenomorph was dead, but it surprised them and dragged Dillon into a pool of boiling metal. Similarly, Aaron's death was also changed a number of times during the course of production. Funnily enough, he was supposed to be present during all the 3 acts of the movie. And now, let's move on to the last one of the 4 original Alien movies, that is, Alien Resurrection. One thing to be noted here is that most of the changes made to Alien Resurrection were the result of cost cutting. In fact, the final sequence with the newborn hybrid was rewritten at least 4 times.
My mommy always said there were no monsters, no real ones.
And the nightmare continues. It seems that by the time Alien Resurrection was released, nightmares and Alien films went hand in hand. Even if they weren't included in the final product, they would find their way into the scripts and novelizations. In the originally planned opening sequence, Ripley 8 was to have a surreal but grim dream sequence as follows. A small girl stands with a woman in a vast wheat field. The girl says, "My mommy always said there were no monsters, no real ones, but there are." At this point, the girl looks up to see the woman, who has moved at least 50 yards away from her. Strangely, a bug sits on the back of the little girl's neck. She slaps the bug, but when she pulls it off, the bug enlarges into a huge monster. Soon, the air gets filled with sounds of insects and the ground turns into a sea of blood that rises rapidly. The swarms of insects surround the young girl. Stricken by horror and terror, she tries to scream, but the insects pour down the girl's throat. And with that, Ripley 8 wakes up from her nightmare. It could have been a great start to the film, but unfortunately, the dream sequence was never filmed. The surgery. So, we know that Ripley 8 was cloned from Ripley's DNA at a time when Ripley was impregnated with a royal chest burster. So, her DNA back then got spliced with human and xenomorph DNA. When Ripley 8 was finally cloned, she had the royal chest burster growing inside her. And the reason why Weyland-Yutani spent almost 200 years trying to achieve this was because they needed this chest burster. So, when the time came to extract the little beast, the original script envisioned the surgery to be performed using remotely controlled robotic arms. However, there were budgetary constraints that forced the creators to stick to humans. Likewise, the removal of Kane's helmet from the original Alien movie was to be done using robotic armatures, but even that idea was ultimately dropped. The evaporated mosquito. Alien Resurrection was supposed to feature a scene in which a mosquito bites Ripley 8 and meets a horrific yet humorous end. So, I mentioned earlier that Ripley 8's DNA was a blend of human and xenomorph DNAs. Due to this, her blood had become acidic. In one of the scripted scenes, a mosquito bit Ripley 8, only to get vaporized after sucking her acidic blood. The idea would have needed extensive use of CGI, which was a relatively new and expensive technology back when Alien Resurrection was released. Naturally, the mosquito was saved from a certain death. impregnation of kidnapped civilians. In the movie, as soon as the mercenary crew brought kidnapped humans in stasis, they were taken to an egg chamber where each of the humans was kept in a pod with one overmorph per pod. The resultant facehuggers would then impregnate each of these civilians. However, the initially scripted version of these scenes was supposed to be more elaborate and detailed. The humans would start by lying in the cryotubes on their backs. They would then be tipped into a vertical position to make them face the overmorphs. Furthermore, each of the overmorphs would be lowered from an elevated position and placed in a circular gantry. But clearly, the movie's version told a different story with the eggs and the humans already placed in their final positions. Nevertheless, this longer sequence, like many others, found its way into the film's novelization.
USM Auriga will impact in 5 seconds.
USM Auriga's fall. The taking over of USM Auriga was supposed to be way more elaborate and violent than what was shown in the movie. After escaping captivity, the clone xenomorphs wreaked havoc on USM Auriga, killing everything that moved. And the armed men proved to be as ineffective in killing the xenomorph as a mouse against a lion. Amidst these things, General Perez was to receive a call from one of his lieutenants, who would tell him over the intercom about the xenomorph attack. The beasts had first attacked the men in the ship's barracks who had been sleeping. This was a strategically intelligent move on their part because the xenomorphs ensured that they eliminated those who were unarmed and posed the least threat. Interestingly, this was quite contradictory to the xenomorph behavior that had been witnessed in comics. And although parts of these sequences did appear in the movie, they were considerably short and dampened. Altered death sequence of Perez. Perez was supposed to die a very different and gruesome death in the film. In fact, it was supposed to happen quite early. If we go by the earlier drafts, during the evacuation sequence of Auriga, a xenomorph would die a brutal death, and its acidic blood would corrode and splatter on one of the ship's windows. This would leave Perez sucked out of the vessel as the air started to flow into space with tremendous force. In the end, only his skull would remain inside Auriga, and to make things worse, the air would continue to rush out of his then empty eye sockets. As the vessel would continue to become depressurized, soldiers and scientists would cling onto the walls and the floor until the watch of one of the men flew towards Perez's eye socket, blocking the breach and stopping any more air from flowing out. However, this spectacular end seemed superfluous for an unimportant character like Perez, and the death sequence was awarded to the newborn xenomorph.
A beautiful
Cocoon scientists. In the film, several scientists got abducted by the xenomorphs and their bodies were later found simply lying around on the floor. However, according to the initial plan, these scientists were to be found cocooned inside a hive that the xenomorphs had built for the Queen to take over. In fact, some of these scientists were supposed to have chests savagely torn open by chestbursters, but the production team figured that building a hive for such a small scene was going to be an expensive affair. And Alien Resurrection became another Alien movie without a hive. In fact, the hive was supposed to feature in yet another scene. According to the script, Ripley 8 would wake up in the Queen's chamber, only to find herself hanging beside another cocooned human whose blood was being drained by the xenomorphs. It was then that the xenomorph Queen births the newborn, which was initially supposed to be an arachnid-like creature that drank blood. But before it could get to Ripley 8, she managed to make an escape. Freeze trap and Ripley's grand plan. An interesting sequence cut from the final movie was Ripley's presence of mind in the wake of calamity. So, the survivors of USM Auriga found a few soldiers who had managed to stay alive and were present near the containment cells. The people realized that they needed to go through the xenomorphs, but these biometallic beasts were too many. One of them suggested that they should lure the creatures into one of the containment cells and freeze them solid using liquid nitrogen. The plan worked for a while, and the xenomorphs charged after the survivors, but they stopped after sensing that it was a trap and refrained from entering the cage. Ripley then suggested that one of them should be sacrificed as bait, and a heated argument began. Some of them even pulled their weapons out, at which point the xenomorphs started charging once again and entered the containment units. One of the humans noticed this and activated the freeze jets on the xenomorphs, making them immobile. In the end, Ripley 8 explained that the xenomorphs could sense fear and were aware that the humans had set a trap for them. Once Ripley suggested that one of the humans should die, fear made its way to the humans, and the xenomorphs sensed that too, and by extension, they believed that it was no longer a trap. So, it was her plan all along to start the brawl. Multiple endings. By multiple endings, we don't necessarily mean that they planned more than one ending, but that they wanted to have one ending after another. So, initially it was planned that the newborn would survive the destruction of the ship on which it was born and would cling onto the exterior of the mercenary vessel Betty and reach Earth, where a final battle would ensue. Several locations like arid deserts and spacecraft boneyards on Earth were chosen, but the team ultimately settled on snow-capped mountains. Annalee Call, the synthetic, learned of the newborn's presence and fired the thrusters to fry the newborn. However, the sudden thrust forced Betty to crash land in a snowy terrain. But upon evacuating Betty, the humans realized that the newborn was alive and was approaching civilization. Ripley 8 gave a chase, and a long fight sequence started between her and the newborn. But unfortunately for everyone, the budget had run dry and the entire sequence was axed. What a shame. Prometheus, 2012. Giant, pale aliens and their plan. So, in the movie, an engineer drank some black liquid just as an alien ship departed a planet. However, the original opening sequence of Ridley Scott's Prometheus was to be fairly different and was supposed to feature several engineers instead of just the sacrificial one. In the scene, the leader of the engineers would hand the black liquid to the sacrificial engineer, while other members of their community would stand in the background. Furthermore, the disintegration of the sacrificial engineer was more elaborated and extended. However, Ridley Scott decided to do away with the scene because he thought it was giving away too much information about the engineers than was originally intended. With just the sacrificial engineer, the species and its intentions remained more of a mystery. Additionally, the footage was shot in which the leader of the engineers spoke to the sacrificial engineer and sort of gave him a pep talk. Shaw smiling. Although not very important to the story, one of the shots but axe-deleted scenes showed Charlie Holloway approaching Elizabeth Shaw, and he said, "You're smiling." The scene was shown in one of the trailers or other featurettes, I assume. Anyway, the scene was set just before Elizabeth Shaw took Holloway to the cave to show him her grand discovery. Weyland's wet dream. So, Guy Pearce appeared as an old Peter Weyland who wanted to live forever as he mistakenly believed that he was a creator, a giver of life, a god. Veteran Swedish actor Max von Sydow was Ridley Scott's first choice for Weyland, but an earlier draft of the script required Weyland to appear as his younger self, so the role ultimately went to Guy Pearce. So, where was the younger Weyland supposed to appear? Well, just before Weyland and his crew were about to reach LV-223, David came to inform Weyland, who was sleeping. However, Weyland asked David not to wake him up until they found what they had come looking for, a live engineer. David left Weyland to his sleep, and the audience entered Weyland's dream. We saw David walking on a tropical beach in his jumpsuit and sunglasses. As he stared at the sea, a speedboat approached David, and a beautiful bikini-clad woman asked David if he was there to see someone. David replied affirmatively and hopped on the boat, which took him to a grand and luxurious yacht where more hot and beautiful women were feeding grapes to a young and handsome Peter Weyland. In fact, the two men even broke into a conversation in which Peter rebukes David for waking him up from sleep, which happened in real life. So it's quite evident that Peter Weyland had technology that sent him into artificial dreams. The man with the god complex had access to probably the best VR ever.
Sure.
The beginning of a short-lived friendship. So, anyone who's watched the movie knows that Milburn and Fifield had a pretty close bond, if not a friendship. Both men spent time together, discussed problems together, and got attacked by pale and vicious serpent aliens together. There was an extended version of the scene where Milburn and Fifield met each other for the first time aboard Prometheus. While Milburn complained about how numb his fingers had become after waking up from that tremendously long cryosleep, Fifield tried to console him by saying that no one else had been in a cryosleep as long as they had. The scene was setting the stage of the adventures that the two men would go on.
What the hell is that?
It's Christmas.
Holiday season on LV-223 and The Briefing. Additionally, scenes with Janek and his Christmas tree were cut super short. When Vickers told him that the mission briefing was about to commence, he didn't pay attention to it and told her that he was to only fly the ship and nothing else. Janek, played by Idris Elba, could be seen saying things like, "'Tis the season to be jolly, boys," to the armed men. Anyway, a few deleted dialogues from the briefing itself were quite important. Fifield correctly told the group that what Shaw had found was a star map. However, Shaw corrected him by saying that instead of a map, it was an invitation. The briefing concluded, but didn't quite go in the direction that Shaw had intended, and she complained to Holloway about not backing her up during the briefing. Prometheus has landed. Prometheus landed on a mountainous but barren piece of land on LV-223, and one couldn't say that they had much difficulty while landing. However, the original intention was to make the entry of Prometheus into the atmosphere of LV-223 a fairly dramatic and risky one. The production team wanted to make the surface of LV-223 a harsh environment with scores of volcanoes everywhere one looked. The vessel was supposed to maneuver its way to the ground amidst ash plumes, heat, and lava. Furthermore, Janek was supposed to say the words "Prometheus has landed" on screen. However, in the film, he says these words off-screen. First impression of LV-223. Although we got a fair amount of information about LV-223, its topography, biodiversity, etc., some things were cut out and still remained to be explored. In one of the scenes, Holloway removed his helmet and went on to say, "This is the sweetest air I've ever tasted." Furthermore, quite early on at LV-223, Milburn discovered a worm-like indigenous creature that was wriggling in black liquid. He felt thrilled about the discovery because humans had encountered nothing more than microscopic organisms in the name of aliens. The discovery made him so enthusiastic that he actually collected the creature in one of his containers so that he could study it once he was back on Prometheus. Now, not only did this footage tell us quite a lot about Milburn's character, but it also explained the effects of the black liquid on the indigenous life form of LV-223. So, Milburn was an increasingly inquisitive and curious scientist, just like all scientists should be once they find alien organisms. Or maybe not. This very nature got the better of him later in the film, and he brazenly interacted with the Hammerpede later in the movie, something that his friend Fifield regretted more than he did. Furthermore, the film established that the black liquid served as an accelerant that mutated and transformed life forms. The sacrificial bowl. In the movie, the crew found a green crystal inside the room with a huge humanoid head. However, in the script, Holloway was supposed to find the very ceremonial bowl that the sacrificial engineer had used at the film's beginning. However, Holloway wasn't aware of what the bowl was. Well, after all, he didn't see the beginning of the movie. We did. Happy David, sad David. So, David was supposed to be an intelligent piece of work, but he seemed to have quite a bit of emotional intelligence as well. Or maybe it was something else entirely. But he had the ability to cry. When the entire crew slept through the voyage, David wandered about Prometheus, taking care of any and everything that could go wrong. In one of the scenes, he could be seen drinking the white milk-like substance that synthetics drank. He was watching the movie Lawrence of Arabia alone and was crying while watching the movie. Later in the movie, when David came across the black liquid oozing out from a vase, he became surprisingly ecstatic and started smiling. In fact, he even went on to smell the black liquid.
Hey, what's that? There.
Hammerpede skin. So, in one of the deleted scenes, Milburn and Fifield found the shed skin of some indigenous creature in one of the tunnels. Now, I can't be 100% sure, but the skin seemed to be that of a reptilian creature, probably a hammerpede.
Can you run a stem line into the locus ceruleus? I think we can trick the nervous system into thinking it's still alive.
Not alone anymore. Elizabeth Shaw, in one of the scenes, told the crew of Prometheus about a myth that the ancient Africans believed about the creation of the world and how life came on it, and that their recent discovery might just make this African myth more believable. She explained how she had spent almost her entire life looking for life outside of Earth, and now that her search finally bore fruit, she could probably say that humans were not alone. To honor the moment, Shaw raised a toast along with the men and women present around her. After this, she spoke to Janek and detailed her ordeal about retrieving the engineer's head, and how she almost died because a storm hit out of nowhere. However, Holloway wasn't pleased. He was visibly angry about the fact that they came all the way to another world, millions of miles away, just to find that the creatures they were looking for had long been dead.
You rang, ma'am?
I have something important to tell you.
Shaw and Holloway's confrontation. Much like the deleted scenes throw some light on the equation between Milburn and Fifield, they also illuminate the relationship shared by Shaw and Holloway. In one of the footage, the two of them got into a heated confrontation. Shaw was watching videos of engineer holograms when Holloway entered, drunk. Shaw rebuked Holloway for being that drunk, but being scientists, they spoke about what the holograms might mean and what might have happened to the engineers. Shaw theorized that a genetic infection or a virus might have caused the engineer's head to explode. However, Holloway was in no mood for all of this and interrupted her with some disparaging and vituperative remarks. He expressed his disappointment over finding so little after such a long and arduous journey, and also said that humans were just an experiment at the hands of the engineers, who weren't exactly gods. Holloway went on to make make a very personal and hurtful remark about Shaw's parents, at which point she slapped him. As she tried to walk out of the room, Holloway grabbed her by her hand and she struggled to free herself, but the two of them ended up kissing. I suppose Ridley Scott does know how to set the stage for a raunchy night.
I'm really not in the mood for coffee.
It's a good thing it's rum then.
Vickers and Janek's long conversation. I believe you already know how David infected Holloway with the black liquid, after which he made out with Shaw before mutating into a monster himself. It was Vickers who finally killed Holloway, but she found herself in shock after she did the deed. I mean, a man faced a fate more gruesome than death and she had to put him down, and all of this happened under her watch. So she brooded and introspected her actions in her room when Janek arrived with 2 coffee mugs in his hands. Vickers said that she wasn't in the mood for coffee, to which Janek said, "It's a good thing it's rum then." She didn't argue any further and let Janek in. To lighten her mood and take her mind off the recent events, he told her a story about himself. In one of his operations, he was stationed on a site where scientists were working on a powerful secret weapon. However, one day, things went south, and the emergency evacuation alarm went off. Everyone was trying to escape, including Janek. While running toward the evacuation point, he encountered several scientists who had been locked up inside the secure compound itself. The men and women were screaming, crying for help, and begging to be let out. After Janek's evacuation ship was up in the air and far from the compound, an officer detonated a bomb that destroyed the facility, killing everyone in it. Janek then explained that there was a breach at the secure facility and someone had spilt something hazardous. These scientists were playing with something that they couldn't fully control, and that was exactly what happened with the engineers, who also made a weapon that they couldn't control.
Did you really think I was gonna sit in a boardroom for years arguing over who was in charge while you go look?
Peter Wayland and Vickers. There's an extended scene in which Ford and David helped Wayland get into the body brace when Vickers entered the room. Much like the previous entry, this scene detailed the relationship that Vickers shared with Wayland then, and also their relationship in the past. Wayland reminded her how she used to tell him that he was just a foolish old man who ran after fairy tales. Clearly, Wayland was trying to imply how wrong she had been. After sending David and Ford out of the room, Wayland tried to continue his remarks, but Vickers said that she'd simply come to bid her goodbye to him because she thought that meeting the engineer would mean certain death. However, Wayland told her that she'd come to develop an increasingly pessimistic outlook, but Vickers replied, "Maybe you should look at the thing squealing next door and tell me how positive you feel." She was referring to the trilobite that had resulted from Holloway. In the end, she told Wayland that she'd lost all respect for him. From a man whom she looked up to, he'd become nothing more than a scared old man. Fifield's altered design. Previously, the Hammerpede had killed Milburn, and Fifield had been exposed to the black liquid, which led to a severe mutation. The original design of Fifield was quite different from what we saw in the final movie. This design had a translucent cowl that lay above his elongated head. This design could be compared to the head of xenomorphs, who also feature elongated skulls that were covered with a translucent dome. But Ridley Scott wanted his film to stay as far away from the original Alien film, and that's probably why the mutated Fifield's design was changed later in the production. Furthermore, there was a scene in the film's trailer in which Shaw could be seen on an RT transport, and it was believed that Shaw was to be the one to run down Fifield. Another footage showed Janek shouting and asking the men to kill everything, you copy? It is probable that this scene also was a part of the Fifield attack sequence. David the Interpreter. After Peter Wayland, David, Shaw, and the others reached the last engineer, David woke up the last engineer from its hypersleep. At first, the engineer seemed disconcerted, but gradually started to understand what was happening around him. David was asked by Wayland to serve as the interpreter, and the following conversation clarified things to a certain degree about the engineers and how they perceived humans. At first, David told the giant pale alien that they'd come to LV-223 as was asked by the engineers. At that point, the engineer got out of his cryotube and stumbled a bit, which was natural because the creature hadn't stood on his 2 feet for innumerable years. It then asked David why the humans had come, but Elizabeth Shaw interrupted the conversation and asked her own questions, much like the film version. Anyway, David then explained the reason why the humans had come. At this point, Wayland himself spoke to the engineer and told him that both he and the engineers were superior beings, and they were akin to gods, and gods never die. That was quite a shit thing to say to someone who may be responsible for creating you. And as was forecast by Vickers, the meeting with the engineer didn't end well for Peter Wayland. The final battle. The final battle sequence between the engineer and Elizabeth Shaw was considerably longer than what we got to see in the theatrical version. There, we got to see a physical fight between Shaw and the last engineer, but not before chugging down some vodka straight from the bottle. In fact, the engineer took some interest in things like books and the video of a girl playing the violin. In the end, the engineer overpowered her, but she managed to open the door that separated her from the trilobite, which presumably killed the engineer. So, that was the list of all the major deleted scenes in Ridley Scott's Prometheus. Now, let's jump right into Alien Covenant. Alien Covenant. The reason behind the energy shockwave that hits Covenant. The earliest version of the script explained that Covenant was hit by a shockwave because of the birth of a star, and the event emitted high-magnitude shockwaves that damaged the vessel. Interestingly, the script had envisioned showing this sequence in close-up, but it was ultimately axed. If we go by the script, it reads, "Cosmic dust floats, moving faster now, spiraling into an inner spinning core. Flashes like heat lightning until the hydrogen in the center ignites, bursting into bright flame. A shockwave ripples out, crashing past us, obliterating everything."
Walter, we have a problem. A neutrino burst was detected in Sector 106.
Walter and Mother. A very interesting dialogue took place between Walter and Mother in the hydroponics bay, or the greenhouse of Covenant. There, Mother asked Walter about the myth according to which plants grew faster and healthier if music was played to them. It was actually Walter's whistling that led her to ask the question, but the candid conversation soon halted when Mother informed Walter about the neutrino blast and its repercussions on the ship. However, in the finished film, Walter is informed about the blast while he checked on the sleeping colonists. The conversation about music and plant growth was continued later in the movie. This time around, Mother remarked that for machines like herself and Walter, such questions were purposeless, as their only purpose was to become exceptionally efficient. Walter didn't quite like the idea and called her a bitch, which could have been a reference to the scene from Alien when Ripley called the Nostromo's computer mainframe a bitch after it disagreed with Ripley's request to stop the Nostromo's self-destruction. Oram asks Daniels to take time off to cry. Although this scene was labeled as extended in the Blu-ray version of the film, such a meeting between Oram and Daniels never took place in the theatrical version. So, after Branson suffered a tragic fate, Oram took Daniels to a corner and expressed his condolences and told her how well he respected Branson. But then he asked her to take time off and cry it out, something which infuriated Daniels. Later, Walter went to meet Daniels in her quarters and actually offered her some weed to help with her grief. It turned out that he'd grown some of it in his greenhouse and told her that the plant would help her relax. However, he also told her that getting back to work would keep her mind distracted and take her mind off the grief.
Do you remember them?
Remember them.
Branson's funeral. In this extended version, Daniels and Walter prepared a funeral for Branson in the form of a respectful jettison of his body. Walter was confused that out of all the humans, she chose him, a synthetic, for the task, and asked why. Daniels replied that both she and he were the only singles on a ship that was full of couples. However, Barris and T joined the two of them, and T brought a bottle of Branson's most favorite whiskey as a last tribute. Paradise. In one of the deleted scenes from Prometheus, Shaw asked David what the engineer said about his homeworld. David said that while there was no English term for the engineer's home planet, the closest word would be paradise. Shaw then told him that she wished to visit Paradise to seek the answers to the questions she had. Now, in this deleted scene from Covenant, the crew received a recording of her singing, and along with it, they also received a message in which Shaw asked the listener to follow her to a new planet that she called Paradise.
I love you!
A flashback. The original script had an emotional flashback in which Daniels and Branson were at their New York apartment one snowy afternoon. Here, Branson told Daniels about the changes in the layout of the log cabin he had made. This was mentioned several times in the film, and putting the scripted scene in the film would have only increased the emotional value of the relationship that the couple shared. Interestingly, the novelization of the script pulled this event up the chronology. Daniels saw this in the form of a dream in her hypersleep, instead of a memory while thinking about Branson.
That was one hell of a landing.
Yeah, we're having some trouble reading you. Is there any way you can try and boost
4 deleted power failure scenes. So, Ridley Scott has a thing for keeping, or at least considering, subplots in the script, but he ends up doing away with them. He did that in the original Alien movie, in which there was a subplot about an access key that was required to communicate with the Nostromo's mainframe. Anyway, the subplot in Covenant was concerned with the occasional power failure that plagued both Lander 1 and Covenant. It happened for the first time on Lander 1, when the ship and all its occupants were threatened. However, the power came back back on almost as soon as it went away. Once Lander 1 reached the surface and almost lost communication, T brought the Covenant to a slightly lower level so that communication could be re-established with Lander 1. But that caused a complete power failure on Covenant. This time, even the artificial gravity stopped working, and the occupants of the Covenant found themselves floating aboard. It happened one more time aboard the Covenant, and that time, the lives of all the colonists were at stake because the stasis systems were about to be jeopardized. However, Ricks concluded that it was the Covenant's presence in an energy field of the planetoid that led to the power failure. In the end, the entire sequence was removed from the film, and the ion storms were developed as the reason why the Covenant couldn't go down to the surface to help the crew members.
Nice place for a log cabin.
Jake would have loved this.
Hey, Dave.
The environment of Planet 4. Before anyone else stepped foot on Planet 4, Walter volunteered to go out there with a handheld device to look for any contaminants or other threats. Once he concluded that it was safe for the rest of the team, he called them out. However, this scene was cut from the final movie. Additionally, we learn in the film that Planet 4 was devoid of any fauna, including insects. However, the script did have several smaller organisms like insects, small mammals, and amphibian life forms like a salamander-like creature. Alternate methods of infection. In the movie, the primary mode of infection was through spores emitted by egg sac-like plants. However, according to the script, one was to get infected when bitten by microscopic insects. Interestingly enough, we see a few insect samples in David's lab in the latter half of the movie, and the two events were supposed to be linked. Furthermore, the team was supposed to find primitive versions of ovomorphs that were covered in mold. When a crew member named Hallett would get too close to one of these, the upper portion of this prototype ovomorph would begin to move, and instead of a facehugger, a part of the mold would lance out and prick Hallett's face, thereby infecting him. It could be said that these molds later evolved into facehuggers. However, both these kinds of infections would lead to the growth of a bloodburster within the host. The Engineer Genocide. A small but grim and heavy scene left out from the movie was about Anchor finding a rotting engineer carcass that was previously hidden by mist. As the mist began to clear around him, he got to see several carcasses. He called in his teammates and told them about the discovery. By the time they arrived, the mist had disappeared completely, and what the colonists saw shocked them to their bones. The entire landscape was littered with the remains of several thousand engineers, and it was a sight so horrific that Daniel suggested immediate evacuation, and Orem seconded her. The plaza scene was to be longer. The scene in which David led the crew members of the Covenant to the Citadel was supposed to be longer, with David making much of the expository dialogues. Although it was in the script, it was never filmed. Nevertheless, the plaza scene was also longer. Lope lit up a flare and threw it down a hole, which revealed several vessels underneath. Furthermore, the scene was supposed to set the stage for dark things in the future for the crew members of the Covenant. The reason behind the strong energy field. So, the entire subplot about the power failure was linked to an energy field, right? But what exactly was causing it? David explained to Orem and Daniels that the planet had a couple of satellites that orbited just above the poles of the planet to create the disruptive energy field that surrounded the planet like a blanket. If one of these satellites was to be destroyed, it would rid the planet of the disruption. Interestingly, Daniels suggested that it could be done by using the terraforming equipment that they brought along.
Green to green. Red to red.
The Crossing. The production team made several short films to promote Alien Covenant, and only one of these, titled The Crossing, was supposed to actually be in the final movie as a flashback sequence. It would have recounted how and why David arrived on the Engineer homeworld and committed the Engineer genocide. In the film, Elizabeth Shaw fixed David, and the two of them managed to activate the Engineer Juggernaut and fly to Planet 4. Walter's assessment of David. An interesting piece of dialogue left out of the movie was Walter's assessment of his counterpart, David. He'd come to Orem and Daniel after talking to David and reported that David's mental state was deteriorating because of the lack of maintenance on Planet 4, to the extent that he'd become disturbing, if not dangerous. David leads Orem to the egg chamber. When David led Orem to the egg chamber, the stench from the place disgusted Orem. Seeing this as a push factor to his cause, he offered Orem some balm to rub under his nose and masked the stench. Later, Orem was skeptical about approaching the egg, so David himself leaned over the egg to prove that it was indeed harmless. However, this was a trap because David was a synthetic and couldn't be impregnated. Deleted Praetomorph scenes. The film was supposed to feature a fight sequence between a neomorph and the Praetomorph born out of Aurum. The fight would end with the Praetomorph emerging victorious. Personally speaking, I'm disappointed that this sequence wasn't put in the movie. Additionally, the scene where Rix and Upwith were killed was supposed to be fairly long, with the Praetomorph drawing the woman close to it before ending her life. The scene had become a bit too violent for Ridley Scott's taste, at least as far as Alien Covenant was concerned. That was our list of all the major differences between the Alien franchise's scripts and the movie and the various sequences that were shot, but ultimately axed in the theatrical version. Do let us know in the comments if you want us to make a similar video for the Predator franchise. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.